In 2013, frozen beef burgers sitting in supermarket freezers across Ireland and the UK weren't entirely beef. This wasn't a small, isolated mix-up. It touched millions of packages already sitting in carts and freezers before anyone caught it. Within weeks, supermarkets across multiple countries were pulling products off shelves overnight. One sample pulled from a Tesco shelf came back 29% horse. And the method that actually caught it barely exists at the level most of us shop at.
The discovery wasn't even the result of a targeted fraud investigation. Irish food regulators were running routine background tests on frozen meat in late 2012, nothing related to fraud at all. They noticed DNA in the samples that didn't match what was on the label, so they retested, specifically checking for horse this time. The results were impossible to ignore. Out of dozens of beef burger products tested, more than a third came back positive for horse DNA, and the vast majority also carried undeclared pig. One frozen lasagna brand, tested separately, turned out to be almost entirely horse, with no beef in it at all. None of it showed up on an ingredients list, a label, or anything a shopper could have checked. It got darker from there. A batch of meat pies served in UK prisons, labeled and sold as halal, tested positive for pork DNA. For anyone whose diet forbids pork on religious grounds, that's not a labeling inconvenience.
That's the exact violation the label was supposed to prevent. In response, regulators across Europe ordered an emergency testing program. Thousands of random meat samples checked specifically for horse DNA across nearly every country in the EU. Investigators followed the meat backward to figure out how it got there in the first place. The trail ran from Romanian slaughterhouses through a Dutch trader who had already been convicted once before for this exact kind of fraud, into a French supplier, then a processing plant in Luxembourg. By the time it reached a shelf in Dublin or Manchester, that meat had already passed through 4 countries and at least as many companies. Every single link in that chain had a chance to notice something was wrong. None of them did. Or none of them said anything. The economics behind it were almost insultingly simple. Horse meat was cheaper to source than beef. And once it's ground into a burger or folded into a ready meal, it looks identical to the real thing.
That single fact, that processing erases the visual difference between species, is the entire reason this kind of fraud works. A whole steak gives itself away instantly. Ground meat never gets the chance to. This also wasn't a one-time event that got cleaned up and forgotten. Years later, a Dutch wholesaler was convicted of selling over 300 tons of horse meat as beef, much of it moving through the same kind of international supply chains. He was sentenced to 2.5 years. The original Dutch trader behind the first scandal went back to prison too, having already been caught doing exactly this once before, years earlier. Sentences that light, next to profits that large, don't function as much of a deterrent.
Here's the part that should bother you more than the scandal itself. Scientists studying meat fraud use something called DNA barcoding, sequencing one specific gene that works almost like a species fingerprint, then matching it against a global reference database. When researchers quietly ran that test on ordinary ground meat pulled from regular grocery stores, roughly 1 in 5 samples came back mislabeled. Other studies, covering deli meats, sausages, and other processed products, have found mislabeling rates running anywhere from 20 to 70%, depending on the category. None of those were scandal investigations or government crackdowns. They were researchers simply buying meat off the shelf to see what was actually inside it.
Most of that testing happens quietly, in academic labs, on small batches of samples, for papers almost nobody outside the field will ever read. It is not something that happens automatically every time a truck of ground beef rolls into a distribution center. Routine species testing across the meat supply chain is the exception. It is not the rule. In the United States, the most recent nationwide survey of ground meat for species mislabeling, done before modern DNA testing even existed, dates back to 1995. Even the horse meat scandal was only caught because of one country's background monitoring program. And it isn't only the cheap stuff that gets faked. At the other end of the price scale, the exact same blind spot shows up wearing a much more expensive label. Genuine Kobe beef comes from one breed of cattle, raised in one specific region of Japan, under rules strict enough that only a few thousand animals qualify in a given year. As little as 400 pounds of the real thing enters the entire United States in an average month. Yet for years, some of the most famous steakhouses in New York advertised Kobe on the menu while serving something else entirely. At one of those steakhouses, that fake Kobe was sold for between $175 and $350 a plate. One owner, confronted with the discrepancy by investigators, argued that the name on the menu shouldn't matter as much as people were making it out to. Across the country, only a handful of restaurants, fewer than 10, are actually certified to serve the real thing. It wasn't a food safety agency that caught most of these restaurants. It was a television investigation. Under current labeling rules, retail beef only needs to be roughly 47% Wagyu genetics to legally use the word Wagyu at all. The rest can be ordinary cattle.
Every time you've ordered a premium cut without asking where the paperwork came from, you've been trusting a system you've never actually seen. So the uncomfortable question isn't really whether something like this could happen again. It's how many times it already has, quietly, in products nobody thought to test. The ground beef sitting in your fridge right now has almost certainly never been sequenced. Not because it's definitely fine, because almost nobody ever checks.